Welcome back. So now I'm going to explain the systemic and pulmonary circulation and the differences between them. This is, I don't even know what lecture number it is, but we're gonna get into it. So for starters, there's two different types of circulation. Like I just mentioned, there's pulmonary and systemic. Systemic is going to be the circulation that carries oxygenated blood from the heart out into your organs and muscles and tissue, and then it returns the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. This circulation carries 84% of your blood volume. And then the pulmonary circulation is the one that's going to carry the deoxygenated blood from your heart out into your lungs so it can get oxygenated and deposit the carbon dioxide and then come back to your heart as oxygenated blood. That's the difference between those two. There is a mean arterial pressure of systemic circulation, which is around 70 to 105 millimeters per mercury, and then there's the pulmonary pressure, which is 10 to 22. So the pulmonary pressure is going to be your low pressure circulation, and then your systemic circulation is going to be your high pressure circulation. You can imagine, because the systemic circulation has to go all the way to your body, and then the pulmonary circulation only goes from your heart to your lungs, and that's it. Then we're going to talk about the hemodynamics, which is all the things that affect the way your blood flows, basically. So we're going to have blood flow, we're going to have resistance, and we're going to have pressure. So these three things, blood flow, for starters, is just the quantity of blood that passes at any given point at any given period of time, any given moment. And then the systemic circulation is going to be identical to your cardiac output. So if you can imagine, if I take out blood from my heart, so my cardiac output, that systemic circulation is going to be equal to what the blood just gave me. That kind of makes sense. They go together. Cardiac output, systemic circulation, and then back to the heart. However, to calculate your blood flow, you're going to have the change in pressure over the resistance. That's going to give you flow. That's your Ohm's law. And then speaking of pressure, so pressure is the force exerted by blood on any unit area of the vessel wall. This is stored potential energy. So if you have an increase of resistance, you're going to use more potential energy, which is going to decrease the pressure because you're using that potential energy, if that makes sense. And then some things that affect it are total peripheral resistance and other types of resistance where I'll talk about later. Then we're going to have resistance, which I just mentioned. So resistance, if we move around this equation, is going to equal the change in pressure over flow, which is what we have here. Pressure over flow is your resistance. And then that is going to be the impediment of flow of blood in a blood vessel. So you can imagine, I don't know, a rubber band, you're creating resistance, or if you're trying to run and someone is pulling you back, they're creating resistance. So that's what resistance will do to your blood flow. So if you can imagine, if you increase resistance, you're going to decrease your blood flow. And then here I put basically like how they all correlate with each other. If you're decreasing the diameter, you have a smaller vessel to push blood through. So you're increasing the resistance and you're decreasing flow because it's smaller. And then since you're increasing the resistance and you have this friction and you have this potential energy that you need to use up, you're using all that energy, which is going to decrease your pressure. And then we also need to know that arterioles are resistant vessels. So since they're so small, they create a lot of resistance. Since they're creating all that resistance, you're going to decrease your pressure. And then the regular functional pressure in your vascular bed is around 17 millimeters of mercury. And then we can come up here and talk about the different types of flow. So we already know that flow is the amount of blood that passes through a blood vessel at any given moment of time. So there's two different types of flow. We have laminar flow and we have turbulent flow. If you think about it, laminar flow, think about you're laminating a sheet of paper. You're making it very smooth. And turbulent, think about turbulence in an airplane. It's going to be interrupted and not as smooth. So that's the difference between those two. So laminar flow is going to be the streamlined flow. When the interior of the vessel is smooth and it's equal in diameter, that's when you're going to have that laminar flow. on the outside, you're gonna have a slower blood flow because the outside of the vessel is touching the blood flow, and that's gonna create resistance, a little bit of friction there, but in the middle, it has the fastest flow. And then in turbulent flow, it's basically the opposite. The interior is not smooth, it's rough, and the diameter is unequal. There's constriction, that's gonna create your turbulent flow. This can be measured by Reynolds number. It's gonna measure your tendency for the turbulent flow, and that's gonna be your velocity times your diameter and times your density, all over the viscosity of your blood. So all of these on the top are going to be directly proportional to turbulent flow. If you increase any of these values here, you're going to increase your likelihood of getting turbulent flow. The only one that's inversely proportional is this viscosity. So if you increase viscosity, you decrease your turbulent flow. If you decrease viscosity, you increase turbulent flow. And he did say that he really wants you to know the units of flow, which are really just volume over time, so milliliters over minutes and liters over minutes as well. And yeah, so now we can go over here and we can talk about total peripheral resistance versus pulmonary vascular resistance. So really the difference here is just the resistance in your peripheral body, so in your systemic circulation, and then your resistance in your pulmonary circulation in your lungs, so, in between your lungs and your heart. So here, as you can see, we have the resistance of blood flow, but here we have a difference when our blood vessels are organized in a series and when our blood vessels are organized parallel. Series is just the blood vessel is one after the next, one after the next. They're together, it's arterial, capillary, venular vein, they're right behind each other. But then your parallel is when they start to branch and then they run parallel to one another, but they're not one behind the other. They're just running parallel. So here you can see the difference of how that's calculated. R, again, is just resistance, which is change of pressure or flow. So if you have a series, you just add all your resistances together, and that's how you get it. However, if you have a parallel, you do the inverse. So you divide one over your resistance, and then you add all of those. The good thing about parallel TPR, which is the total peripheral resistance, is that it's going to allow the tissue to regulate its own blood flow independent to other tissues because we're getting different branches from different vessels. And then parallel TPR is going to be less than 1 unit of blood. I think he did one single blood vessel, I think he did mention that the parallel TPR is usually less than 1, so keep in mind. Now we're going to talk about the pulmonary vascular resistance. So now instead of talking about the systemic circulation, we're talking about the pulmonary circulation. And this resistance is going to be 1/6 of the total peripheral resistance, which is usually equal to 1 when we're in series, obviously. But our pulmonary vascular resistance is going to be 0.4, which is 1/6 of TPR. And the way we calculate this is when you take the mean pulmonary pressure of your arteries and then the mean pulmonary pressure of your veins, you subtract that and you divide it by your cardiac output. That's how you get the pulmonary vascular resistance. And then over here, we can talk about the venous system and what it correlates in either circulation, whether it be pulmonary or systemic. Your venous system is going to be what returns the blood to your heart from your capillaries. So these veins are capable of constriction or enlarging. However, when you enlarge a vein, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're enlarging the valves. So if you do have an overstretching of your veins due to increased venous pressure, and that goes on for a long period of time, maybe even months, you can actually affect your veins and your valves and completely destroy the function of them, and you have non-functioning valves, non-functioning veins, and those are called varicose veins. When the valves in your veins are no longer functioning because you stretched them out so much that now the valves are no longer closing properly. However, things that affect this venous system is we need to keep in mind this right arterial pressure. So we're thinking about the atrium here, where we get the deoxygenated blood from your veins. This RAP is usually going to be 0 millimeters per mercury. And that makes sense because we want to go from a high pressure volume to low pressure volume, and that's how we create blood flow. So we want this to be 0 normally. And then this rap is going to be balanced between your cardiac output and the venous return. The way I like to think about it, that makes it kind of simple, it's just that rap is going to follow your venous return. So if your venous return is greater, then your rap is going to increase. If your venous return is lower, then your rap is going to decrease. But that is in correlation with your cardiac output. Is rap is greater than cardiac output. I mean, if your venous return is greater than your cardiac output, or if your venous return is less than your cardiac output. And then these are some things that he said in class that he would be asking that weren't in the objectives, but I just wanted to touch base on this, is that what are the things that are gonna affect your pulse pressure? So you can imagine that you increase your volume, you're gonna increase pressure. You can imagine if you increase your vasoconstriction, if you decrease your compliance is stiffness. So if you decrease how stiff something is, it can stretch and you can push more blood through that. And then if you decrease heart rate, usually if you decrease your heart rate, your body's gonna wanna compensate for not getting as much blood as it needs, and then you're gonna increase your pressure and therefore increase your pulse pressure. One of the objectives is to understand the basic theory of circulation and circulatory function, which is like blood moving from the cranial and caudal vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, left atria, left ventricle, and so forth. So you can check out the Heart as a Pump lecture, and that should cover that objective. And that seems about it for this lecture. Thank you for watching.